During week 2, we will be talking about distribution and finance models. If we're looking at the US theatrical distribution rights and compare the distribution model between the studio and the independent producer, we will notice that the studios release their films in theaters based on agreements they have with the theater owners, the exhibitors. And in those agreements, the theater owner and the studio decide what the box office split is, meaning how much of the box office revenues are held by the exhibitor and how much of the box office revenues go to the studio. The studio also pays for the P&A campaign, which is the campaign that creates awareness for the theatrical release coming up. Such P&A campaign costs are recouped from the box office revenues, and other distribution and merchandising revenues that the studios will achieve with the film. Now, an independent producer manages US theatrical distribution rights by A, selling the rights to a US theatrical distributor, like a studio, who then releases the film in the theaters. Or B, he can self-release the film theatrically through a rent-a-studio deal or a four-wall deal with a studio, and he would then finance the P&A. Renting a studio means you are paying a studio to release the film for you. You're paying the studio distribution fee, and you're also paying the print and advertising fee to create the theatrical release campaign, and then the studio on your behalf releases the film in the theaters based on the agreement you have with the studio. Four-walling means you do not use the studio. You create a P&A campaign yourself, or you work with a company that does this outside of the studio system. They would book the theaters for you. You would book the theaters, you would pay the theaters, you would pay the P&A, and you basically put the movie into the theaters yourself. You're four-walling the theater because you pay for everything. You can sell the US rights to a US distributor who would then decide to release the film simultaneously, meaning at the same time, in the theaters and on a VOD platform or a streaming platform. This is often done with a limited theatrical release, meaning a release that is done on a limited number of screens in the US. Or you could not release the film in the US at all, and then you would just sell non-theatrical rights, meaning television, streaming, and any other rights that are non-theatrical, to a US buyer, and you would do that either through a sales agent or a talent agent like a CAA or an ICM, who often handle US rights. When we talk about international distribution, the studios actually handle their international distribution outside of the US through their companies outside of the US. So there is a German version of a Warner Brothers, there is a French version of a Warner Brothers. So they would handle the international distribution very similar than they would handle it in the US by creating a P&A campaign and by recouping all the costs from the international box office revenues and so forth. But the independent producer would handle the international distribution a little different. On behalf of the producer, a sales agent would actually manage those distribution rights and sell them to a distributor in Germany, or a distributor in Spain, or a distributor in France. And it's those German, French, English distributors who would then release the film in the theaters in Germany, England, Spain, wherever they are, on TV and on the streaming platforms. So the sales agent would manage the rights on behalf of the producer, selling them to a distributor who would then distribute in the various distribution windows. So the difference between distribution and sales is distribution is actual distribution in a theater, broadcasting on TV, streaming, online, versus selling is simply selling those rights to the distributor for them to do so. Television financing is slightly different. Television market obviously includes broadcast and cable networks, premium channels, OTT platforms, and streaming services. The revenues for those entities mainly derives from advertising and or subscription. And the content is usually realized through in-house developed content or content that is brought to them through an outside producer, which could be through acquisitions or through a first look deal that they have with a producer, where the producer brings them all the ideas that they have first, and then if the network rejects it, The producer can do with it whatever it wants. And or a co-production split rights deal, as well as a buy-on deal, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, the television industry today is in a bit of a bind because network stations do need more content because they're facing the competition with the streaming services, but they are losing ratings because the viewers are going towards the streaming services. Decreasing ratings also means a decrease in advertising revenues, and with a decrease in advertising revenues, the acquisition budgets go down. So while the network station needs product and has a larger demand, it cannot really pay for it, at least not as much as it did maybe a few years ago. Producers have options. So they can sell a project with a pickup deal to a network station, where the network would pick up the project and then develop it and produce it and distribute it and own it outright, and the producer would receive a producer fee, which would also happen, by the way, with the streaming service. Pickup deal is the same for a streaming service as it is for a network station. Or the producer can independently finance the project and keep the rights and the control. It's not dissimilar for television than it is for film. Now, for television, the producer would develop an idea and then he could pitch it to a network station or a streaming service. And again, as a result, streaming service or network station could say, we love it, we'll take it, we'll pay you a producer fee and you go home. Or the producer could develop the idea, pitch it to a network station, maybe attach a showrunner, make it a little more interesting, and then maybe attach some money. So now the producer would go to a network station or a streaming service and say, here, I have this idea, but I also have some money and I have a little bit of packaging. What do you want to do? Streaming service network station could potentially agree to a co-production deal where the network station or streaming service would own domestic rights and the producer would own and control international rights. And we have seen in week 1 it's not such a bad idea. The last option the producer also has is that he can develop an idea, produce a sizzle reel, pitch it to a network and say, I'd like to buy time on your network. So now the producer is paying the network to buy a time slot, and in that time slot the producer can release his show. The coin of that is that the producer will not receive a license fee from a US network station because he's paying them to buy a time. The upside is the show is released on a US network station and the foreign rights are still available and the producer can still make money with international distribution rights. We talked about a distribution overview and we'll go much deeper into it, not just in this module for this week, but in upcoming modules as well. I'd like to sum up an overview here for a basic finance plan. These finance sources that we were listing here are currently available for producers who want to finance film or television projects. Obviously, we have equity financing, we have GAP, which is bank financing, we have mezzanine financing, we have distribution financing, incentives, in-kind services, and brand sponsorships. I know this all sounds like Chinese right now. I promise you we'll learn all about it as we go forward. For now, I'd like to focus on the main elements for this week. And those main elements are A, we have to create a valuation where 70 to 75% of our production budget can be projected to be covered by revenues from international sales, international distribution. If it's less than that, the risk for the project is higher. Of this 70 to 75 international sales projections, 30 to 35% should ideally become actual pre-sales, meaning actual sales that are made to distributors during the time the film is being put together, meaning before it's produced. A bank will cash flow those distribution contracts, and this is one part of a bank loan. The second part of the bank loan is the gap financing, which is a loan component that is lent against the rights that have not yet been sold. So the bank recognizes that there are more rights to sell other than the 30 to 35% that just have been sold, because our estimates are 70 to 75% as a projection. The bank will lend up to 20% of the budget against rights that still will take place, ideally during the term of the loan, so the bank can get paid back. Ideally, every finance plan should include production incentives because these production incentives are not recouped, meaning you do not have to pay them back. Production incentives are incentives provided to producers who shoot in certain regions that offer those incentives, meaning when you go there, you shoot in New Mexico will give you a credit or a rebate in relation to the amount that you have spent there. And this kind of incentive is not repaid. When we talk about equity, we always want to make sure we don't exceed the 35% bracket, because anything over 35% is going to be risky for the equity investor unless he takes over the bank position, and we'll talk about that a little more. You do have the option to include mezzanine, which will obviously reduce the equity. It can also reduce some of the pre-sales, but you have to be careful how you balance it out so that the movie still has a solid base for financing and not has too many elements in the finance plan that have to be repaid. You'll learn all about this in this first week, but you'll dive definitely much deeper into it as you go through all the 11 modules to come.